Normandy, July 1944. A captured German panzer commander sits in an interrogation tent. He is exhausted, covered in dust, and trembling. He is a veteran of the Eastern Front. He has fought the Russians, he has fought the British. But he tells his American captors that he has never experienced anything like the last 24 hours. "It is cheating," he mutters. "Against the Russians, we would see the cannon flash. We would hear the whistle. We had time to move. But with you Americans, we stop our tanks for 5 minutes to refuel and suddenly the sky falls. Not one shell, 50 shells, all at once, from nowhere." He didn't know it, but he hadn't been defeated by a bigger gun. He had been defeated by a room full of men with pencils, charts, and telephones. He had been defeated by the Fire Direction Center. To understand why this was a revolution, we must go back to how artillery was fought for centuries. In World War I, and even in the early stages of World War II for the German and British armies, artillery was a point-to-point weapon. A battery commander would stand on a hill, look through his binoculars, see a target, and then personally calculate the math for his 4 guns. He had to figure out the angle, the wind, and the elevation. It was a slow, rigid system. If a target appeared 2 miles to the left, that commander couldn't shoot at it because he couldn't see it. The guns were tied to the eyes of their specific commander. The artillery was powerful, but it was fragmented. It was a series of small, disconnected punches. But in the 1930s, in the dusty plains of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a group of American officers led by General Carlos Brewer decided to rewrite the rules of war. They realized that in modern warfare, tanks move too fast for the old math. They needed a system where any pair of eyes could command any gun on the battlefield. They invented the FDC, the Fire Direction Center. Here is the genius of the system. The men at the guns, the ones loading the shells, no longer needed to know where the enemy was. They didn't need to see the target. They didn't even need to know what they were shooting at. They just needed to follow orders. The brain of the operation was moved away from the noise of the cannons into a quiet tent or a bunker, the FDC. Inside this tent, the war was fought with geometry. When an observer on a hill or in a plane spotted a German tank, he didn't call a specific gun battery. He simply radioed the FDC and said, "Target at these coordinates." Inside the tent, the FDC team went to work. They took that single report and plotted it on a map. Then, using standardized firing charts, they calculated the firing solution not just for 4 guns, but for 12, or 24, or 48. Within minutes, the FDC would relay specific elevation and azimuth numbers to every battery within range. The result was terrifying efficiency. A single lieutenant hiding in a bush with a radio could whisper a coordinate, and the FDC would translate that whisper into a thunderstorm. For the German army, this was baffling. Their doctrine relied on precision and individual skill. The American doctrine relied on mass processing. The Germans treated artillery as a sniper rifle. The Americans treated it as a shotgun. The FDC turned the American artillery divisions into a single massive organism. The batteries were the muscles, but the FDC was the central nervous system. It allowed the U.S. Army to shift fire from a target in the north to a target in the south in a matter of moments, without moving a single wheel. When the U.S. Army landed in Europe, they didn't just bring firepower. They brought a new kind of warfare where trigonometry was as lethal as high explosives. The German commander in that interrogation tent was right to be afraid. He was fighting soldiers, but he was being killed by mathematicians. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. A German Panther tank rattles down a muddy road. The commander stands in the hatch, confident. He knows the rules of engagement. He knows that if American artillery spots him, it will take them time to react. He calculates that he has at least 10, maybe 15 minutes before the first shells fall accurately. By then, he will be a mile away, hidden in the treeline. He is relying on the physics of World War I. He assumes the Americans are doing trigonometry by hand. He is dead wrong. In a tent 3 miles away, An American corporal isn't sweating over a notebook full of equations. He isn't frantically flipping through pages of ballistic charts. He is holding a simple stick of wood and plastic. He slides a clear cursor along the wood. He stops at a number. He reads a value out loud. 40 seconds later, the Panther tank is vaporized. This was the power of the graphical firing table, or GFT. To the men who used it, it was the magic ruler. To the Germans on the receiving end, it was an impossibility. To understand why this piece of wood was so revolutionary, you have to understand the nightmare of artillery math. Shooting a 105 mm howitzer isn't like shooting a rifle. You don't aim at the target, you aim at the sky. To hit a target 5 miles away, you have to calculate a parabola. You have to account for the weight of the shell, the power of the powder charge, the air temperature, the air density, and even the temperature of the gun barrel. Before the GFT, artillery officers used tabular firing tables. These were thick books filled with columns of numbers. To find a firing solution, an officer had to look up the range, find the corresponding elevation, do the math for the weather conditions, and interpolate between the numbers. It was slow. It was tedious. And in the chaos of battle, when hands are shaking and adrenaline is pumping, it was prone to error. A simple addition mistake could send a shell landing on your own troops. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department realized that the human brain was the bottleneck. So they decided to automate the math. They took the principles of the slide rule, a tool used by engineers, and adapted it specifically for killing. The graphical firing table looked deceptively simple. It consisted of a wooden or plastic base with a sliding ruler inside. On the face of the ruler were lines representing range and elevation. The genius of the GFT was that it visually integrated the variables. Instead of doing the math, the FDC operator simply moved the slide to the reported range. The GFT setting, a correction factor calculated earlier for the day's weather, was already locked in. The operator didn't need to know the formula for ballistic trajectory. He just slid the ruler to 4,500 yards, and the ruler instantly showed him the elevation setting, 320 mils. It turned a 15-minute physics problem into a 10-second reflex. This device democratized speed. You didn't need a degree in mathematics to be deadly. A 19-year-old high school dropout with a GFT could calculate fire missions faster than a doctorate-level German artillery officer using the old methods. The impact on the battlefield was immediate. German tank columns, accustomed to shoot and scoot tactics, found themselves pinned down. They would stop for a moment, and before they could engage their gears, the air would turn into shrapnel. German prisoners of war often asked to see the Americans' automatic cannons. They couldn't believe that standard howitzers could be aimed and fired so quickly. They suspected a new mechanical weapon. They were shocked when they were shown a simple wooden stick. The graphical firing table was the ultimate example of American pragmatism. While the Germans built over-engineered tanks like the Tiger, which broke down constantly, the Americans built a wooden ruler that worked every single time. It proved that in war, the most dangerous weapon isn't always the one with the biggest explosion. Sometimes it's the one that lets you do the math the fastest. The GFT removed the friction of calculation, leaving only the pure, terrifying speed of the response. The Battle of the Bulge, late 1944. A German tank column is moving through a narrow valley. The commander is cautious. He scans the ridgelines for American anti-tank guns. He scans the road ahead for mines. He sees nothing. The valley is quiet. He orders his column to advance, confident that he has achieved the element of surprise. Then he hears a sound. It isn't the roar of a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, nor the rumble of a bomber. It is a high-pitched, irritating buzz, like a lawnmower in the sky. He looks up and sees a tiny, fragile aircraft drifting lazily above the treetops. It is a Piper L-4 Grasshopper. It is made of steel tubing, wood, and cotton fabric. It has no armor plating, carries no machine guns. It has a top speed of barely 85 miles per hour. A German soldier with a bolt-action rifle could theoretically shoot it down. But when the German commander sees this toy plane, his blood runs cold. He screams into his radio, "Take cover! Move! Now!" But it is too late. The pilot of that tiny plane isn't looking for a dogfight. He is holding a microphone. He speaks 3 words into his radio, and miles away, the horizon erupts. This was the Grasshopper, also known as the Maytag Messerschmitt. It was the most unassuming, yet terrifying component of the American artillery machine. The Germans had excellent tanks and disciplined infantry, but they had a fatal flaw. Their communication system was archaic. The German artillery relied heavily on telephone wires laid across the ground. If a shell cut the wire or if a tank drove over it, the battery went deaf. They were blind. The Americans, however, brought a new technology that they mass-produced like Ford automobiles: the radio. The U.S. Army didn't just give radios to generals. They gave them to everyone. They put radios in tanks, in jeeps, in the hands of platoon sergeants, and in the cockpits of these tiny planes. The result was a revolutionary concept called the Universal Observer. In the German Army, calling in an artillery strike was a bureaucratic process. A lieutenant had to call a captain, who called a major, who approved the request and sent it to the battery. Took time. In the American Army, a 22-year-old sergeant crouching in a muddy ditch with SR-300 walkie-talkie had the authority of a god. If that sergeant saw a target, he didn't need to ask permission. He simply radioed the Fire Direction Center. Because of the FDC system we discussed in Chapter 1, his voice was instantly translated into coordinates. This created a net of eyes. For the German soldier, this was psychologically devastating. There was no safe area. If you hid behind a hill to escape the tanks, a forward observer on the ridge would spot you. If you hid deep in the forest, the L-4 Grasshopper would see the smoke of your campfire. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, famously described this helplessness. He wrote that he could not move his tanks in daylight, not because of bombers, but because of the artillery planes. He said, "You look up, you see the plane, and 5 minutes later, your position ceases to exist." The L-4 pilots were incredibly brave. They flew low and slow, purposely drawing enemy fire so they could spot the muzzle flashes of German guns. And once they spotted a German battery, they wouldn't just call in one gun to silence it. They would call in the whole battalion. This radio network changed the geometry of the battlefield. The front line wasn't just where the infantry stood. The front line was anywhere an American eye could see. The Germans were fighting a war of hardware, better tanks, faster machine guns. The Americans were fighting a war of information. By 1945, the lesson was clear. You could hide from a tank. You could hide from a sniper. But you could not hide from a frequency. As long as that tiny, buzzing plane was in the sky, every square inch of ground was a kill zone. The Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. The Elsenborn Ridge. To understand the true horror of American artillery, you have to understand the psychology of the soldier. For 4 years of war, veterans on both sides had learned a simple survival instinct. It was Pavlovian. You hear the distant thump of a gun firing. Then, a few seconds later, you hear the screaming whistle of the incoming shell. That whistle is a gift. It gives you 3 or 4 seconds. In those seconds, you can dive into a foxhole. You can flatten yourself against the mud. You can survive. The first shell is usually a ranging shot. It lands wide. The enemy adjusts his aim. Then the second one comes closer. You have time to prepare for the barrage. But in late 1944, the Germans encountered a phenomenon that violated the laws of their experience. They called it the sudden storm. The Americans called it TOT, time on target. Here is how the Americans orchestrated this symphony of destruction. Imagine a German infantry battalion gathering for an attack in a clearing. They are 5 miles away from American lines. They are confident. They haven't heard any guns firing. The air is silent. What they don't know is that an American forward observer has already spotted them. He has radioed the Fire Direction Center. In the past, the Americans would have ordered one battery to fire. But today, the FDC commander decides to wipe the grid square off the map. He orders a division TOT. This involves 12 different artillery battalions, nearly 150 guns, spread out over miles of countryside. Some are heavy 155mm long toms located 10 miles back. Some are smaller 105mm howitzers located only 2 miles away. If they all fired at the exact same moment, the shells from the nearby guns would arrive first, warning the Germans to take cover before the heavy stuff landed. So the FDC does the math. They calculate the time of flight for every single gun. They tell the heavy guns in the back to fire at exactly 6 hours. The shell will take 40 seconds to arrive. They tell the medium guns to wait and fire at 6 hours and 20 seconds. They tell the nearby guns to wait longer and fire at 6 hours and 30 seconds. Back in the German clearing, it is 6 hours and 39 seconds. It is still silent. The birds are singing. The soldiers are eating breakfast. The shells from the heavy guns are high in the stratosphere. The shells from the medium guns are beginning their descent. The shells from the nearby guns are screaming just above the treetops. And then, the clock hits 6 hours and 40 seconds. In a single heartbeat, 150 shells impact the earth simultaneously. There is no whistle. There is no warning. 1 second, there is peace. The next second, the entire clearing erupts into a wall of fire and steel. The shockwave alone is enough to kill. The fragmentation creates a grid of death that is mathematically inescapable. At the Battle of the Bulge, this tactic broke the back of the German offensive at Elsenborn Ridge. German prisoners taken after a TOT barrage were often found in a catatonic state. They weren't just physically wounded. They were psychologically shattered. They described the experience as being struck by God's fist. One captured officer asked his interrogators to see the automatic artillery belt-fed machine guns he was sure the Americans possessed. He refused to believe that single-shot cannons could coordinate such instant devastation. The time-on-target mission took the one thing a soldier values most, reaction time, and stole it. It proved that the most dangerous weapon the Americans possessed wasn't the explosive power of TNT, but the precise synchronization of time itself. By late 1944, the German soldier had learned a hard lesson. To survive American artillery, you had to dig deep. A foxhole was the only sanctuary. When a standard high-explosive shell hits the ground, the blast goes upward and outward. If you are below ground level, the shrapnel flies harmlessly over your head. The Americans knew this. They knew that to break the stalemate at the German border, they needed a way to kill men hiding in holes. 4 years, American scientists at Johns Hopkins University had been working on a top-secret project, codenamed POSIT. It was a secret guarded more closely than the atomic bomb. Until December 1944, General Eisenhower had forbidden its use on land in Europe. He feared that if a dud shell fell into German hands, their scientists would reverse engineer it and use it against Allied bombers. But when the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the situation became desperate. Eisenhower unlocked the secret weapon. The shells arrived at the front just in time for Christmas. The German soldiers crouched in their frozen foxholes, waiting for the usual barrage. They heard the shells coming. They braced for the ground impacts. But the impacts never happened. Instead, 10 meters directly above their heads, the air exploded. This was the VT variable time proximity fuse. It was not a timed fuse that guessed the distance. It was not an impact fuse that needed to hit something. It was a smart shell. Inside the nose cone of every shell was a miniature radio transceiver, a tiny radar set made of vacuum tubes rugged enough to survive being fired out of a cannon. As the shell spun toward the Earth, it transmitted radio waves downward. When those waves bounced off the ground and returned at a specific frequency indicating it was exactly 30 feet high, the fuse detonated the shell. The result was the perfect airburst. Instead of exploding in the mud, the shell exploded above it. It turned the steel casing into thousands of razor-sharp fragments and rained them straight down. For the German infantrymen, there was no longer any such thing as cover. The foxhole transformed from a shelter into an open grave. Pine forests, which usually offered concealment, became death traps as the airbursts turned the trees themselves into lethal wooden splinters. The psychological effect of the VT fuse, combined with TOT missions, broke the spirit of the German army in the West. German POWs interrogated after these attacks were despondent. One hardened SS veteran told his captors, "We could fight your tanks. We could fight your infantry. But there is no fighting a weapon that knows exactly where you are hiding and decides for itself when to kill you." Conclusion. When we look back at how the U.S. Army crushed the Wehrmacht in 1944 and 1945, it is easy to focus on the overwhelming numbers, the thousands of Sherman tanks and P-47 fighters. But brute force alone did not win the war of attrition. The true American advantage was invisible. It was the fire direction center that centralized the brainpower of the math geeks. It was the graphical firing table that turned complex physics into a simple slide rule movement. It was the radio network that turned every GI into a forward observer. It was time on target that eliminated the chance to escape. And finally, it was the VT fuse that eliminated the places to hide. The Germans were masters of the tactical battle, relying on the individual brilliance of their tank commanders and the grit of their infantry. But the Americans industrialized the kill chain. They took the chaos of the battlefield and turned it into a math problem, a problem they solved with terrifying efficiency. In the end, the German army wasn't just outfought. It was outcalculated.